A moment is coming when the locks behind modern life stop meaning what they mean today. And when that line gets crossed, this stops being a tech story. If that sounds exaggerated, stay with me, because the people closest to this risk are already moving like the countdown is real. And here's the part most people miss. By the time the world calls it Q-Day, the real damage may have started long before that day ever arrived. This is where the story stops sounding theoretical. Once governments, banks, and infrastructure teams start planning around the same problem, you're not looking at a niche tech debate anymore. Because encryption isn't some side topic buried in a lab. It sits under logins, payments, secure updates, private messages, and a huge amount of the trust modern life runs on every day. And that's exactly why this doesn't get fixed with one update. You're talking about replacing the trust layer inside massive old systems that were never built for a fast, clean transition. So when serious institutions start moving years in advance, that tells you something. The window is smaller than it looks, and even that is not where the real danger begins. The hard part to understand is that encryption doesn't live off to the side somewhere. It sits underneath normal life, the parts people use every day without thinking twice. It helps decide what's real, what's trusted, what gets in, what gets blocked, and which systems are allowed to talk to each other without setting off alarms. And some of the information behind those locks doesn't expire next week. Medical histories, legal records, private archives, research, identity-linked data. Some of it stays valuable for years. Then you scale that up. Secure communications, restricted systems, sensitive coordination, high-level institutions, they're relying on the same basic idea of trust holding up under pressure. That's when this stops feeling like a niche security issue, because once you see how much is sitting on that hidden layer, the real question becomes, if that trust cracks, what doesn't?
So what is Q-Day really? It's not the day quantum computing gets invented. It's the point where some of the digital locks we trust stop being strong enough to trust the same way. A lot of modern encryption works because for normal computers, certain problems are just too hard to solve in any useful amount of time. That difficulty is the protection. Quantum computers matter here because they don't approach every problem the same way normal machines do. And for some of the locks modern systems rely on, that difference changes everything. That doesn't mean every device suddenly breaks at once. It means some of the systems that prove identity, protect communication, and verify what's real can start losing the certainty they were built on. And that's why Q-Day is more dangerous than it sounds. It may not look like a giant visible collapse. It may look like a world still running while trust underneath it starts to crack. But even that is only part of the story, because the most unsettling part of this threat may begin before the world ever reaches Q-Day at all.
Here's where this gets more unsettling. An attacker doesn't need to break strong encryption today if the real plan is to save the data and come back when the lock gets weaker. And that matters because some information has a long shelf life. Medical history, legal records, research, private archives, sensitive communications. A lot of it can still do damage years later. Which means the collection phase doesn't have to look dramatic. In a connected world, valuable encrypted data can be gathered quietly, stored cheaply, and left unopened until the timing changes. That's what makes this threat feel a lot closer than people think. Not because every file matters forever, but because enough of the important ones do. So Q-Day may not be the beginning of the attack at all. It may be the moment years of stolen encrypted history suddenly become readable. And once you see it that way, the timeline changes.
The most dangerous part of this story may have started long before the world ever realizes it.
One of the first places this would show up is identity. If systems can't confidently prove who's real, access stops feeling solid almost immediately. Then you get into finance, not because money vanishes in one dramatic moment, but because banking depends on records, instructions, and transactions being trusted as authentic. The same goes for digital signatures and software trust. Modern systems don't just need data protected, they need to know updates, sources, and instructions are actually genuine. And once you move into secure communications and restricted systems, the stakes get even higher. Now you're talking about trust inside environments that are built around controlled access and verified coordination. It doesn't stop there either. Supply chains, routing, scheduling, infrastructure decisions. Once trust weakens in the systems guiding those processes, the effects move out into the physical world. That's the part that really matters. These aren't separate problems. They're different parts of the same trust layer, and they all start looking vulnerable for the same basic reason. So the first thing Q-Day may threaten may not be the machines themselves. It may be confidence in what's real, what's verified, and what the system still deserves to trust.
This is where it stops looking theoretical. A payment that should clear doesn't. A record that should verify gets held, and suddenly the problem has a public face. Then it hits somewhere people can't shrug off: a clinic, a pharmacy, a necessary service. And now this doesn't feel like a glitch anymore, it feels serious. The same thing starts showing up in access and identity, travel, work, verification. The systems people rely on to quietly say yes are no longer saying it with the same confidence. And it doesn't stay there. Workflows stall, approvals pause, trusted software actions get questioned. The brake starts moving faster than people can explain it. That's the moment everything changes, not because the world collapses in one shot, but because enough visible systems fail at once for people to realize this is no longer random. And once that starts happening in more than one place, it doesn't stay isolated for long. A delay becomes a line becomes manual review, and manual review becomes a bottleneck. That hits hardest in places people actually need: clinics, pharmacies, essential services. The problem isn't just that things slow down, it's that certainty now takes more time than the system was built to give. Then it spreads into movement itself: travel, deliveries, scheduling, handoffs. Anything that depends on trust clearing quickly starts absorbing the same pressure. Institutions try to compensate, but that creates its own problem: more human review, more exceptions, more fallback steps. The response keeps things alive, but it also makes everything heavier. And that's when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The world is still running, but in multiple places at once, it's now slower, tighter, and much harder to trust.
At that point, the world doesn't stop, it falls back. More paper, more manual checks, more people doing work the system used to handle quietly on its own. And people change with it. They keep receipts, they save records, they double-check what used to feel automatic. Trust stops being something you assume and starts becoming something you manage. Institutions keep moving too, but differently. Slower approvals, more supervision, more layers between a request and a yes. Stability is still there, it just doesn't feel effortless anymore. That's when the atmosphere of daily life really changes. The city still runs, stores still open, travel still happens, but the rhythm underneath it feels tighter, heavier, and less reassuring. And that may be the real horror of Q-Day. Not one giant moment when everything dies, but a world that keeps going while trust inside it slowly stops feeling alive.
Maybe Q-Day doesn't look like the end of the world. Maybe everything is still running, and that's exactly what makes it feel so unsettling. Because the real damage isn't just what fails, it's realizing normal life can keep moving even after people stop trusting it the same way.